Hello, everyone, and you're very welcome to this very special installment of our public interview series. We are joined here by the Dr. Paul Oquist Kelly. He's the Minister for National Policy of the Government of Nicaragua and the Secretary to the President of Nicaragua, Comandante Daniel Ortega, as well as the Climate Change Special Envoy. Minister Oquist, thank you very much for joining us here tonight. We're very glad to have you on. What we'll be discussing tonight will be a bit about the history of the Sandinista party and movement in the light of this week being the 41st anniversary of the revolution against the Somoza dictatorship and the victory of Sandinista power. So thank you very much for coming on tonight.
Very pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So I suppose we'll start off with a general outline of the Sandinista movement. Could you talk to us about that, please, about the original movement going back to Carlos Fonseca and Thomas Borge and so on, up until the victory of the revolution in 1979?
On the 19th of July, 1979, the people of Nicaragua have a tremendous historic victory. It's a victory that put an end to 45 years of dictatorship imposed by the United States after the treasonous assassination of Augusto C. Sandino, who had resisted and defeated the U.S. Marine intervention in Nicaragua, U.S. control of Nicaragua. He had had a peace agreement with recently elected President Sacasa. He had dined with President Sacasa. His motorcade was coming down from the presidential palace. It was intercepted by the members of the National Guard headed by Anastasio Somoza Garcia, with the connivance of the U.S. Ambassador Arthur Lane Bliss, and Sandinista and Augusto Cesar Sandino and some of his associates were taken to an airfield and assassinated, putting an end to the peace agreement between the government and Sandino after the departure of the Marines, because the Marines had departed on the 1st of January, 1934. They had arrived in 1909 and again in 1912, and Nicaragua was subject to one of the most onerous types of colonialism you can imagine. The railway, the customs house, the bank were all controlled by the United States. The Brown Brothers Bank of New York controlled the Nicaraguan bank and signed the money as the Brown Brothers, the Nicaraguan money. And the reason for controlling the railways and the custom house was to control the exports, to be able to charge the coffee exporters charges that were going to go to Brown Brothers to repay loans after the U.S. had obliged Nicaragua to refinance with Brown Brothers instead of the Ethelberger Syndicate of London. And to achieve that, the Secretary of State Philander C. Knox, who was a secretary to a Nicaraguan gold mine company owned by people from Pittsburgh that he represented, complete and absolute conflict of interest, had written this famous note to Knox telling the president to leave, President Zelaya, because the U.S. was intervening and the troops were sent in. A general, Benjamin Celedon, resisted that, and it cost him his life as he resisted the entry of the Marines. Then, after a liberal conservative civil war, Henry Stimson, who was very important in Washington in the First World War, between the wars and the Second World War, he was Secretary of State, he was Secretary of Defense in the Second World War, and so a very important figure came to Nicaragua and cut a deal between the liberals and conservatives. And it was the U.S. takeover of the country, that all of the conservatives would lay down their arms and the liberals also, and the U.S. Marines would become the armed force, and then they would organize a Nicaraguan force, and at the beginning, all of the officers were U.S. Marines. You would have a captain and U.S. Marines on loan to the Nicaraguan National Guard with the rank of lieutenant colonel. And the countryside, the police were the U.S. Marines. It was that complete and onerous. Sandino rejected that colonialism, defended national sovereignty, and his troops in the north of the Army for the Defense of National Sovereignty of Nicaragua successfully eluded the Marines, attacked the Marines, and with great dignity defended the sovereignty of Nicaragua. And it ended as I had previously described, after his assassination, when a peace agreement had been met. And then the National Guard went to Huihuili in the north, where the Sandinistas were settling in cooperatives, and slaughtered the remaining Sandinistas in a genocide. A great number of them died. The Somoza dictatorship was one of the bloodiest in the history of Latin America, and it lasts all the way through the 19th of July, 1945, when Somoza Debayle, the last Marine, was obliged to leave Nicaragua. And that was with the vanguard of the Frente Sandinista Liberación Nacional, which had been organized in 1961 by Carlos Fonseca, Comandante Carlos, Comandante Tomás Borges, and another group of companions who struggled throughout the 60s, who took the home of a prominent Somocista figure at one point during a party, and held hostage a group of very prominent people. And that allowed people like Daniel Ortega and others to leave jail and travel to Cuba. Then, of course, there was the famous taking of the National Assembly the year before the victory with Comandante Cerro, El Pastora, and another group that also allowed a large group of Sandinista prisoners to be freed. And then in 1978 and 1979, we have different offensives in Esteli, the Southern Front, which was sort of a conventional warfare, guerrilla warfare, and then urban insurrections, all combined to overthrow the Somoza dictatorship, with the U.S. working continuously to try to avoid that outcome. The first year, 1980, was difficult, of course, but by 1981, Nicaragua had the fastest growing economy in Latin America. And major initiatives have been launched. The literacy campaign, agrarian reform was just starting. And then there was an area of people's property that was formed from the confiscated firms of the Somozas. So we had a mixed economy ipso facto, because we had the private sector, a mixed sector, and the public sector, the people's property sector, which was the 40% of the economy that had been owned by Somoza and his henchmen. And that was all confiscated, and that created this area of people's property. The U.S. administration, with Ronald Reagan as president, immediately began, when it took power, an aggression against Nicaragua. And in 1984, Senators Kerry and Kennedy headed a move to stop the financing of the Contra and its fight against Nicaragua, which passed the U.S. Congress, which meant that the Reagan and Bush administrations got involved not only in violating international law, but also U.S. law, because Congress had forbade that financing. They got something from the Emir of Brunei. They got some funds from the owner of Domino's in the United States. Oliver North did a couple of transactions from the basement of the White House. Very inventive, an innovator. That Israel would give arms to Iran, imagine that, and then Iran would give funds to the Contra. But the real financing, the big time financing of the war from 1984, all the way through 1990 was cocaine. And as a matter of fact, Eugene and Paul, the Iran-Contra scandal, which the administration could survive, was a spin. It was a spin to cover up the real underlying scandal of how the Contra were financed, and that was the CIA cocaine crack distribution in the black ghettos and Latin barrios of the United States in the 1980s. There was an epidemic of crack addiction. And this had been sponsored by the CIA bringing cocaine into the United States. And then it went to Los Angeles, California, where there was a black gang entrepreneur, very inventive also, with his microwave and baking soda. He turned an elite, expensive product, cocaine, for Wall Street lawyers, Hollywood stars, and very rich Wall Street types. He turned that into a mass production, low-cost product, cocaine. Very addictive. And that is to close the circle. When they paid off a fellow by the name of Blandino, a Nicaraguan, who took the money to 380, who was the head of the Contra. And that's how the Contra was financed. There's been several films about this in recent years, about the pilots who were flying the cocaine to the United States with the protection of the CIA. So the war dragged on through the 80s. They were never able to defeat the FSLN, but with the war, with the financial embargo, with the commercial blockade, commercial embargo, a financial blockade, they were wearing down the economy. Coming into 1988, 1989, the workers were asking for arroz, frijoles, y azúcar, AFA, arroz, frijoles, and azúcar, rice, beans, and cooking oil. They didn't want money. Inflation was running at 34,700%. It was Weimar Republic type of inflation. But the Nicaraguan people prevailed, and the U.S. could not defeat us militarily. But that what was for the U.S. low intensity warfare, but for us was catastrophic intensity warfare, led to the people of Nicaragua concluding that the United States wasn't going to even honor the promise to end the war with the election, even if the Sandinistas won. And so the opposition won. But the FSLN left power with its political base intact, and then ruled from below from the year 1990 through 2006, defending the rights of the people, defending the rights of the cooperative that had received their titles from the agrarian reform when the neoliberals were trying to roll that back. The neoliberals also didn't respect the Constitution and instituted cost recovery for health and education, which excluded the poor, the poorest of the poor, from being able to have an operation to be able to send all their kids to school. And then we came up to the miracle of return to power, which usually doesn't happen in revolutions. The second chance. In 2006, winning the election with 38% of the vote. And then you get into the very first day of the new administration, President Ortega announces the restitution of the constitutional right of free universal health care and free universal education. This is in the second poorest country in Latin America and the Caribbean. You know, the United States spends 17% of its GDP on healthcare and doesn't have a national system. Half of it's private, the other half is Medicaid and Medicare, and it's an archipelago of different programs in different states and different cities and localities which we can see the disastrous result of that now with the COVID-19, in which the European countries have handled it fairly well, and in the United States, the handling has been disastrous because they don't have a health system. And so that and other subsidies represent $852 a year for a family of 5. And the subsidy to the transportation in Managua adds up to over $500 a year for a family of 5. You add that up, that's $1,300 in the second poorest country. That is big time redistribution. We all know that markets concentrate, and to redistribute, you need the action of the state. There's no other way for it to work. But we've not only done that redistribution, we've given the restitution of rights to the people. We've included previously excluded groups into national society: women, youth, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant people of the Caribbean coast. The Caribbean coast itself, which was always isolated and neglected in the class-conscious, class-based, and racist neoliberal regimes. We've also had investment in public goods that are to the benefit of everyone. Peace and security, the safest country in Central America, avoiding the cartels and the Mara youth gangs that make life miserable in some of our neighbors. We don't have that. Nicaragua, on the contrary, is a contention wall against that for Central America. So you add all of this together, and this is what has permitted Nicaragua to have growth with poverty and inequality reduction. So we were growing at 5% a year on average between 2010 and 2017. And poverty had been reduced from 48% to 24%, and extreme poverty from 17% to 6.9%. But success is not always appreciated. And those in Miami and the hardliners in Washington were not enthused about seeing a successful left-wing government in Latin America. And there's antecedents for this in the U.S. history. Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 was the most successful city in Reconstruction. There was a fusion political party of whites and blacks, a white mayor, but a city council with the representation of blacks. There were black Congress people in the U.S. Congress at that stage of the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. This is 30 years after the Civil War. And a very prosperous business class also, a black newspaper, a whole series of professionals. Wilmington, North Carolina was the prime example. In Oklahoma, there was, in Tulsa, there was a place called Black Wall Street, where the merchants were so powerful and so successful that it was the Black Wall Street. But once again, we see that that's not appreciated by the white supremacists, and 2,000 of them raided Wilmington, North Carolina, burned down the section. The Fusion Party had to escape, flee for its life, burned down the black newspaper there, and destroyed what they had put together in Wilmington. In Tulsa, there was the greatest race riot in the history of the United States in 1921, and over 300 black people were killed by a white mob that could not tolerate successful blacks, rich blacks. And I think that for those in Miami who do not want to see a left-wing government in Central America succeed. But then again, people in Europe tend to underestimate, think that the question of the coup d'etats and the dictatorships is a thing of the past in Latin America. But let's recall that in this century, there was a 2002 coup against Chavez. There was the 2004 coup that ousted, a military intervention that ousted Jean-Bernard Aristide from Haiti, even though he had just won the presidential election with 91% of the vote, but that wasn't good enough for the imperialists. Then there was the 2009 intervention in Honduras overthrowing Mel Zelaya. The U.S. claimed that it didn't have anything to do with it, but Hillary Clinton in her autobiography couldn't resist detailing her important role in the overthrow of the Mel Zelaya government. So it's quite clear the Secretary of State was directly involved. Then we have the police kidnapping Rafael Correa in Ecuador that didn't pan out, the overthrow of Lugo in Paraguay, the overthrow of Dilma in Brazil, and then in 2018, the attempted coup in Nicaragua, followed in 2019 by the overthrow of Evo Morales and the plurinational government in Bolivia, which we hope that that is not the end of that story, but the army and the police, with the support of the U.S., overthrew a popular government, elected government in Latin America. So this overthrow of elected governments, it happens all the time. In Europe, it's incredible how some people don't believe in the political elites that there was a coup attempt in Nicaragua. They still believe the Hansel and Gretel story, that this was popular demonstrations that were repressed by a brutal government. When we had the roadblocks on all of the highways and in some of the streets in the cities by these people trying to strangle the economy, the burning down of city halls and other public buildings, the looting of the stores that sold foodstuffs to the low-income people, trying to create a food crisis in the capital. And from these roadblocks and other places, there was the kidnapping of the Sandinistas and others, their torture, stripping them down. And actually, it was something that hadn't been seen in Nicaragua before. These people filmed their own atrocities. They filmed their violations of human rights. They filmed the torture, the stripping down nude of people, using the types of modus operandi that one would see in the Graf prison in Iraq or in Guantanamo, humiliation as part of the torture, and then murders too. So these peaceful demonstrators killed 24 police by gunshot and wounded 418 police, according to the last figure, by gunshot. The good news is that the Nicaraguan police, supported by the Nicaraguan people, stopped the neighborhood invasions and the home invasions, stopped the roadblocks, and it was a very bloody affair, taking down these roadblocks, which had been imposed, maintained by force, and which they resisted giving them up also by force. So a lot of the violence was entailed that. And there had been a huge concerted fake news campaign against the government and the revolution in the corporate media, in other mass media, in the social media. It was rampant in an attempt to overthrow the government. And it's hard to understand why some Europeans, who, when I was in Europe at the time of that, just couldn't understand that there was something going on, when the intellectual authors have confessed it. You have Donald J. Trump, you have Michael Pence, and you have Pompeo, all saying they want to overthrow the governments of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. There's not much mystery in it. And then you have Trump saying, we will not tolerate socialism. We will not tolerate socialism in this hemisphere with Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And we're going to combat socialism in U.S. policies also, and U.S. politics also, I mean. So the intellectual authors have confessed it. There's all the evidence of the bloodshed. But you know something that I learned as a political scientist, I wasn't aware of this, that the human rights people only look at what the state does. They do not look at what non-state actors do. So there would be these atrocities of burning people, the atrocities of the kidnapping and tortures, and it wouldn't figure in their reports at all. And they would say, oh no, those are non-state actors, and the state has the obligation to protect. So it's the state's problem that these things are happening. My God, it's an attempt to overthrow the government. So the government's responsible for the attempt to overthrow the government. It's a pretty warped logic, but that takes place. And so the good news is that there was a great defeat of the imperialist interventionist forces in Nicaragua in 2018. And unfortunately, it was this tragic setback for the indigenous peoples of Bolivia and the world in 2019 with the coup there. But now we're shaping up for the elections in 2021. The FSLN's prime adversary in elections in Nicaragua are always the CIA and the Department of State. You know, it's quite amusing how people get upset with the thought that there might be some intervention by some foreign powers in U.S. elections. There has not been one election in Nicaraguan history that the U.S. has not chosen the opposition leader, financed them, bullied into line, people who didn't want to support the one that they had chosen, bullied business people trying to get them to stop supporting the FSLN. Then there's been psychological warfare applied in 1990 and 2011, including the trying to project the fear of returning to the war, which was one of their major arguments in the elections prior to our victory in the 2006 election. But the people of Nicaragua have appreciated all of the gains, all of the advances of the revolution. I like to say that in the 60s and 70s, Eugene and Paul, there was a sowing of the seeds with so much sacrifice, with so many heroes and martyrs, with so much bloodshed. And then there was a defense of that in the 80s in the war against the counter-revolution. But finally now, after 2007, after the 10th of January 2007, the Nicaraguan people are harvesting the benefits they so richly deserve in health and education and housing, in all of the spheres of human activity. The poor have been benefited immensely in this government. And that is very satisfying that after so much sacrifice over so many years, that finally the time of harvest has arrived, harvesting these benefits for the Nicaraguan people who more than deserve it.
Thank you very much for that. I think one of the things that shows the real interest of the coup attempt in 2018 and the differences between the Golpistas, the coupists, and the FSLN government was one of the policies that has been taken in the aftermath of it has been the Bismarck-Martinez housing project, named after one of the murdered FSLN revolutionaries during the coup attempt, which really does show the interest of the Sandinista government putting people's needs first, as well as in other policies such as zero usury and zero poverty. One of the things that was a staple of Nicaragua before the second phase of the revolution in 2007 was rolling blackouts. That was one of the effects of neoliberalism in Nicaragua. And that touches on an important subject around energy supply, alternative energy, which is the focus, one of the topics of your new book, Equilibria. Could you talk a bit about some of the themes discussed in that, some of your opinions dealing with the need for a global survival movement?
Okay. Well, Nicaragua, with regard to the energy, has gone from 25% renewable energy in 2007 to 77% renewable energy as we speak, on the way to over 90%, which is our goal. And with regard to forestry, We have committed to reforesting 2.8 million hectares of forestry land. So Nicaragua has a very high priority with the environment. Equilibra presents a metaphysics and an ontology of existence to raise our level of knowledge and appreciation for the evolution of the universe, planet Earth, and life on the planet, of which we are an integral and unique part, each and every one of us. It also contains an ontology of extinction, which deals with the cosmic, geological, epidemiological, of which we're very conscious now with COVID-19, and anthropogenic threats to our extinction. Actually, the greatest threats to our extinction today involve our inability to deal with the consequences of our own science and technology, to wit, climate change, which is a product of the Industrial Revolution, of our industriousness and our application of technologies to produce things with dirty energies, as it turns out. Nuclear weapons, one of the greatest human conquests of science and technology was to split the atom and understand the atom, the other being the unraveling of DNA, of the double helix of life. Tremendous advances, but we don't know how to deal with them. And then there's artificial intelligence also. With regard to climate change, the Kyoto Protocol, which entered into force in 2005, was an excellent agreement. It was legally binding. It had specific goals. In Doha, in 2012, it was extended, and the goals were expanded from a 5% reduction in the 1990 rate of emissions to 18%. But there was a problem with this, and that was that the U.S. Senate did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol, so the United States was out. So Europe and the right wing of the countries in of Latin America, which after 2017 have been the Lima Group, they put together the Bali Conference and formed two ad hoc working groups to bring the United States back into the negotiation, even though it wasn't part of the Kyoto Protocol. And then in Durban, in COP17 in 2011, work began on what a new agreement could look like that would bring the United States back in. And Europe made concession after concession to the United States. One of them was that instead of a legally binding agreement, it would be an agreement under the convention with the force of law. We asked the US Treasury lawyers who had invented that scheme what that meant. They had no idea what it meant, but we all knew what it didn't mean. And it didn't mean legally binding, because that ambiguity is what is designed to replace legally binding with an ambiguity. The United States also insisted that all commitments be voluntary. The commitments with regard to the reductions, where they were obligatory in Kyoto. They wanted to replace historical responsibilities with universal responsibilities, that we're all responsible for this, which is not true. We know which countries were the big polluters after 1850. We have that data. We know which corporations were the big polluters after 1850. They don't like the idea there could be indemnizations because of that. So we have then a situation in which we go into Paris and the US agrees to an agreement. You can imagine the disappointment of the Europeans and the Latin American right after so many concessions to the United States that in the end the United States is withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. So really in climate change we have two big obstacles. One are the emissions of fossil fuels, and the other is the United States of America, which has been blocking the Kyoto Protocol, which is now outside of the Paris Agreement, much to the merit of these people involved. There's a movement in the United States called We're Still In, which includes California, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, important states, and a whole myriad of cities. All the big cities in the United States are within the We're Still In movement. But the federal government's negationist, denies climate change, and is basing its economic strategy on fossil fuels, on becoming the largest producer and exporter of fossil fuels in the world, and trying to oblige the rest of the world to accept that. You know, one of the instruments that are being used by imperialism now are the coercive unilateral measures. And these measures do not merit being called sanctions. The only sanctions that are legal are those approved by the United Nations Security Council. The United States, European Union, United Kingdom, Canada, and for some reason, Switzerland joined this imperialist group recently. Who named them to be the moral judge of the world? Who named them to be police, prosecutor, judge, and jailer, and to apply their measures, their illegal measures on people by administrative edict with no judicial recourse? They're violating the civil rights of the countries, of the organizations, and of the people who they apply them to upon application. But when they seize their property and freeze bank accounts, that's another violation of human rights. They're seizing their property by administrative edict based on their illegal measures with no judicial recourse. And then you have the situation in the United States, which is the worst of all, where they claim extraterritoriality for their illegal measures, but don't accept international law within the United States jurisdiction. And then we get to the really bad situation where they criminalize third parties who don't abide by their illegal edicts extraterritorially. And so you get sanctions on companies that deal with Iran, or the threat of sanctions to the companies that are working on Nord Stream 1, where Northern Europe would buy cheap gas in an oleoduct from St. Petersburg to Germany. And the United States president says, oh, we pay for their defense and they're going to buy gas from the Russians. That's not the way the world works. That's a quote from Donald J. Trump's Book of Logic. And so you have those types of sanctions, or the sanctions against the European companies that deal with Iran by the European countries that want to keep alive the Iranian nuclear agreement, for which they've even gone to create a special mechanism to allow that payment outside of the SWIFT banking system. Because one of the reasons why these illegal measures are so effective is because the U.S. has a dictatorship within the banking system of the world called SWIFT. And the banks go into a panic when they think they might be excluded from this payment system, which is with a great part of the world's business takes place with. So now we'll have Glasgow in 2021. We all hope that it's successful because Madrid was a failure. I advised the people there of what could be the formula, but it didn't happen because the Chilean presidency could not say no to the United States and the developed countries. We would negotiate something, and then they would come back to us, not with the negotiated settlement, but rather with the position of the developed countries. That things don't work that way, and we couldn't accept that. And what the developed countries want is to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement to be approved, which would allow them to continue with the carbon market, with the European carbon market. What the developed countries want is finance, and especially finance for loss and damages, and to recognize loss and damages as a full equal part of the climate change edifice, with mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damages. You have Dominica, the island of Barbuda, and Antigua Barbuda. Within the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, you have Abaco and Grand Bahama that have been completely destroyed. completely destroyed. And there's no international mechanism to address that. So there could be an exchange of giving them their carbon market in exchange for finance. You know, the ex-governor of the Bank of London is on the advisory board of the Glasgow conference. He's adept at the money circles. If he could come up with 100 billion a year beginning in 2020 to come up with a payment for 2020 and 2021, that would be a real confidence builder. But we were told that by Hillary Clinton in Copenhagen in 2009, and then it was appeared in the reports of all of the copes of this 100 billion a year, and now it's not going to appear. That is a confidence destroyer. So if the ex-president of the Bank of England and ex-president of the Bank of Canada could come up with funds for loss and damages, mitigation, adaptation, that would be a good thing that the Glasgow organizers could put together, and that would make a great success of Glasgow. 100 billion isn't that much money anymore. The United States has approved 4 trillion already to confront the Great Depression 2020, and that's just for starters. That's going to go deeper. Europe has also approved large sums for that. So 100 billion shouldn't be too hard to come by. I hope it does restore some confidence in the negotiation. We have 2 other areas in Equilibra that we consider to be the greatest risk. One is the 4,000 operational nuclear warheads cocked and ready to launch that threaten the elimination of our species if they're ever launched in a massive attack. And it doesn't have to be a full-fledged war. There can be nuclear accidents. There can be human error. There can be miscalculations. And actually, there's been dozens of them across the year. Equilibra has a sort of an inventory of all of these near misses that could have cost us a third world war. I would like to read from just a couple of them in Equilibra so we can get the flavor of how dangerous the world we are living in is. And on 26 September 1983, the same month that the KAL 007 airliner was shot down over Russia, the Korean Airlines, Soviet radar showed 5 incoming ICBMs. Colonel Stanislav Petrov reasoned that a U.S. attack would not be 5 ICBMs, but hundreds of ICBMs. So he did not act upon that information, even though the backup system was showing the same thing. The real cause were reflections of sunlight on the top of clouds. So we have a cloud illusion that could have led to a nuclear war. During the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a U.S. destroyer, the USS Beale, detected a submarine off the coast of Cuba and dropped training depth charges when it failed to surface. The Soviet B-59 submarine captain ordered a nuclear torpedo aimed not at such small fry as a destroyer, but rather at the aircraft carrier it was escorting, the USS Randolph. But the order to fire required the approval of all 3 senior officers, and the second in command, Vasily Arkhipov, disagreed, and the captain surfaced and requested orders from his headquarters. So we can say that Seaman Arkhipov really saved us. You can imagine a U.S. aircraft carrier being sunk off the coast of Cuba at the height of the Soviet U.S. confrontation over the Cuban missiles. Finally, there's a third one here too. It's on the 15th of April, 1969. North Korea shot down a U.S. EC-131 electronic reconnaissance plane 90 kilometers off the North Korean coast, killing all 33 crew members, all 33 sailors on board. The world waited with a bated breath of what the US reaction was going to be. Recently inaugurated President Richard Nixon had to cope with this complex, stressful situation. So he did so by getting drunk. And in that state, he ordered a tactical nuclear attack on North Korea. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger complied with the president's order, but also advised the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the president was plastered out of his mind and urged them to ignore it until the president could confirm it with his hangover the following morning, at which time he saw things quite differently. But this is just a few examples of most of these harrowing experiences that show us that we cannot continue to leave these nuclear weapons laying around. If they are, it will probably be used finally. So we shouldn't play Russian roulette over and over and over again with these nuclear arms. Finally, I wish to mention that we have the artificial intelligence, which is taken very seriously by scientists, as serious as Stephen Hawking was in terms of a threat to our existence. And the fear is that self-replicating, self-learning robots that can reason could lead to the conclusion, as has been depicted in several Hollywood movies, that human beings are a virus destroying the world and should be eliminated. I think the scientists take this so seriously because they haven't been able to come up with an answer, a credible answer to how they would answer the robot's logic. So I think that that's what strikes fear in their heart. To reach solutions to climate change, to nuclear weapons, to artificial intelligence, we need to overcome a repressive hegemonic power structure, imperialism. This requires, in its sixth phase, full spectrum dominance. This requires fundamental economic, social, and political transformation. It also requires substantive change in our worldview. In equilibrium, there are identified 9 alienations that are leading us towards extinction. The first alienation is to think that only the eternal is valuable and escape transient reality by creating eternity in thought, devaluing now. This is called eternalism. The second alienation is to believe that humans are not dependent on nature, but rather outside of nature, or even somehow above nature, supernaturalism. The third alienation is to posit humans as the masters of all nature, which exists to serve us, and degradation as an inevitable cost of progress. This is called developmentalism. You know, Eugene and Paul and the audience, it was once thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. That's been debunked. Hardly anyone will accept that today. But many people still believe the human beings are the center of the universe. The fourth alienation is to place individual, group, or national consciousness or interest before an other species survival, ultra individualism. A fifth alienation is to prioritize short-term marginal gains above long-term catastrophic losses, even knowing the consequences. This is immediatism. And here we have a real problem because the hegemonic economic and political structures are largely based on this premise of short-term gain, the quarterly report, the next election, even knowing that this can have catastrophic consequences in the long term. The sixth alienation is to think that endless, limitless, mindless growth of production, consumption, and capital accumulation can occur on a planet with limited, degraded resources. This alienation is called capitalism. and it is drying up the resources of the world, seeking this endless, limitless, mindless accumulation of wealth that has led to this 1% concentration, which will be far worse coming out of the great confinement of the Great Depression. You know, in 4 months, Jeff Bezos of Amazon made $29 billion in 4 months, an all-time record. While at the same time, 49.5 million U.S. workers filed for unemployment in the same 4 months. Can you imagine the inequality that is going to produce? The seventh alienation, part of capitalism, is to prioritize financial systems above life support systems. This is called financialism, and we're referring here to the commodity, equity, and derivative markets that are seen as more important than the systems that support life on planet Earth. An eighth alienation is to put all faith in science and technology to replace or compensate for damages we cause to ecosystems or environmental disequilibria. This is called scientificism. We only need to be wrong once. A variant of this are those who think that it's easier to establish human settlements on planet Mars or on a moon of Jupiter than to fix planet Earth, to fix the disequilibria that we're facing on planet Earth. And the ninth alienation is fatalism with two variants, providentialism and nihilism, one resigned and passive and the other negative, obstructive, and prone to violence. In previous centuries, the fundamental economic and social changes were through social movements that have consisted of different sectors in different countries using different methods, but all united by a clear objective: abolish slavery, free the colonies, suffrage for women, labor and union rights. Now, what we need is a movement for survival in the face of the threat of extinction. Sometimes movements fight for centuries, decades, or long years, but suddenly the goal is achieved. In my estimation, many times sudden transformations that lead to success are due to generational changes. A new generation enters on the scene that is thoroughly and almost universally convinced that slavery is a profound evil and immorality. And in July 1831, the UK Parliament abolishes slavery after a long period of fighting by the abolitionists. And then in 1865, the US has the Emancipation Proclamation. And by the end of the century, slavery is largely gone, the type of slavery, African slavery we're talking about, although there's modern forms of it also. In my view, these sudden changes towards success, viewed historically, can be associated with generational change. I hope this is the case for the survival movement in the 21st century. There is a conscious, highly mobilized youth that can make a difference where previous generations have failed. At COP25, I was interested in seeing the progression of Greta Thunberg. You know, in the course of the 2 years she had gone and visited national leaders, that didn't lead to anything. Then she was with the international organizations like the United Nations COPE. When she left that, she was disillusioned and said, only the people can solve this. And that's true. Only the people can solve it, but they need to be organized. They need to be mobilized. They need to be mobilized in a movement that can influence the political parties. They can influence the decision makers. They can influence the economic, social, and political forces of a society. The most interesting moment for me in COP25 was coming back late one night, and Greta had a very large concentration in Madrid. Some people say it was 500,000 people, some say it was more. And they had broken up and people were on the street walking home. And you saw the 16 and 17 and 8-year-olds with their picket signs, with their pancards, and which I had expected. But then I saw 10, 11, 12-year-olds with their PAN cards. And I thought, this is really deep. When you get 10-year-olds mobilized, this means there's a whole generation on the march. And these 16 and 17-year-olds will still be 18, will soon be 18, and they'll be voting. And so you're no longer going to have the passive youth that has characterized some recent years. You're going to have a highly mobilized youth. And if they vote in bloc in countries that have a close correlation of forces, of political forces, they could have more political power than you could imagine very rapidly. And hopefully this could turn the corner for our survival movement and make a difference with regard to dealing with the consequences of our own science and technology with regard to climate change, nuclear weapons, and artificial intelligence. With regard to artificial intelligence, I wish to mention one other thing, which is going to perhaps create social conditions for what we're talking about also. Professor Li, who is the Chinese guru on artificial intelligence, and who at one time was the president of Google China, estimates that 40% of jobs will be lost by 2035. So many of these people who have been sent home as a result of the great confinement derived from COVID-19, these multi-trillion-dollar decisions made by some governments and some states in the United States. When they come back, they can find that their job is not there because the business is out of business, because of downsizing, or because there's a logarithm, a robot, or the Internet of Things has replaced their job. And Lee states that he thinks that this will be a greater disruption of the labor force than the introduction of electricity. So if you have all of these other things that are happening, the world confronting the pandemic of COVID-19, confronting the great confinement and the Great Depression 2020 that it's led to, enormous inequality, and on top of that, the second Cold War, which is already up and running. The United States is already confronting China in the second Cold War, which will be the death knell for globalization. So the changes that we're looking at are huge, and we need all of the progressive groups in the world, all the revolutionary groups in the world, to coalesce around a survival movement to confront these dire threats that humanity faces. We have to put together a response. We appreciate very much for giving us a platform to express these ideas to the people of Ireland. As one of my last names indicates, I have roots in Ireland. Some people wonder why some people in the United States have the E in Kelly. And the story is the following. At a certain time when the Irish immigrants were arriving on Ellis Island in New York Harbor, the migration officials there saw these Irish Kellys and said that LLY was far too many consonants in a row. So they stuck in an E and they changed people's last name. And that's why you have the Kellys with E in the United States, as well as the Kellys without E. I asked my brother when he arrived in Ireland once to find out where the Kellys were from, and he answered me back, they're from all over. So maybe you could give me some light on that. We haven't been able to elucidate it at all. Thank you very much, Eugene. Thank you very much, Paul. If you have any further questions, I'm at your disposition.
Thank you very much, Minister. Just to finish up, I suppose to say that on the question of the climate emergency, that in Nicaragua, to be green is to be black and red, the colors of the Sandinista Front for National Liberation. So thank you very much for coming tonight. Copies of your book.
You know, Eugene, excuse me, but I would like to make another statement on the second Cold War, if you wish. It's 2 paragraphs.
Sure.
Okay. Some people state, why is this coming out of this epidemic that instead of negotiating with the Chinese that the United States has been doing for several years now, all of a sudden we have this pivot to confrontation. And The United States is a country with many contradictions and conflicts, as has been shown in recent weeks. It's been shown on the street. And it's difficult to have a united country without a common external enemy. And the Second World War was fascism. Then it was for several decades, half a century really, communism. After that did not work, it was replaced with terrorism, which doesn't work very well anymore. So China is already being groomed, presented as the next enemy. And as always, the enemy has to be demonized. One time I accompanied Father Descoto when he was president of the General Assembly, and we met with President Haddad of Syria. And he told us, you know, he said, U.S. foreign policy is like Hollywood movies. There's good guys and bad guys. And the bad guys have to be really bad. They have to be demonized. But have you ever noticed that these good guys kill a lot of people doing their good? Like in the movies and like in reality also. A second reason, apart from the need to have an enemy, is that the military budget plus the budget of the 17 intelligence agencies, yes, you heard me right, 17 intelligence agencies is $962 billion, almost $1 trillion. How can that military spending be justified for the benefit of the military, police, intelligence, industrial, and financial complex if there's no enemy? If there's no enemy, how do you justify a $952 billion budget to confront no enemy? So these are two compulsions that exist in the United States to satisfy the needs of the military, police, intelligence, industrial, and financial complex. I wanted to add that little thing on since this is so current right now, the beginning of the Second World War.
I think as we head towards a more multipolar world, the contradictions within the US itself will begin to tear it apart, and countries like Ireland, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, Palestine will be forced to liberate themselves. So Minister Oquist, gracias por venir y patria libre. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and viva Nicaragua. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Happy 19th of July.
Thanks. Hope you all enjoyed Nicaragua, and viva Sandinismo.
Viva Sandinismo.